Chapter 2. Jack and Jamie uncover the hidden dangers of hide-and-seek. Jack was fairly sure that this was the first time he'd been unconscious since that time Paige trapped him in Antarctica. If this could even count as being unconscious. He sure wasn't conscious of the world around him, but he wasn't quite asleep either. Nevertheless, as he was edging back towards consciousness, slowly like trudging through a marsh, he realized that he must have passed out. The first thing he noticed was that he was lying on a soft surface. The second thing was that his head was pounding. The third thing was that wherever he was, it was way too warm. He gave a weak groan, blindly padding around for a staff without opening his eyes. He didn't have the strength to open them. "Oh, look, he lives." Jack froze. He knew that voice. With sluggish movements, he turned around. It took a great deal of willpower, but he eventually managed to pry his eyes open. A couple of overgrown bunnies were standing in front of him, gradually merging into one. "Bunny?" Jack croaked. "The one and only," Bunny said, leaning forward a bit to peer down at him. Jack realized he was lying on a couch in a room somewhere in the workshop, judging by the ever-jolly red and green decorations on the wall. He tried making the image of Bunny clearer by squinting at him, but closed his eyes again when the pounding in his head intensified. "Just a moment ago, there were two of you," he mumbled. "You don't say," Bunny said. "Oh, I think that might just be your fever, mate." Jack opened his eyes again. Bunny had come closer. "Fever?" he repeated. "Fever," Bunny confirmed. Jack peered at him through eyes that were already stinging with the strain of keeping themselves open. "I don't get fevers," he told him. Bunny looked like he was about to answer, but seemed to forget about it when Jack started pushing himself up into a sitting position. Hey, hold on," he said, hopping forwards. He put two paws on Jack's shoulders, keeping him in place. "You shouldn't move around too much. You'll get yourself knocked out again, you Gumby." Jack struggled to break free, but it didn't take too long before his body fell back against the cushions. He held back a moan. "Bunny," he started, looking around himself. Where's my staff?" "We had to confiscate it," Bunny replied with a bemused expression. Jack stared at him. "You what?" Bunny just shrugged, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. It was clear he wasn't used to dealing with this, whether this was dealing with a sick person in general or dealing with a sick Jack Frost specifically. Not that Jack was sick. He couldn't be, right? Jack was rapidly becoming more unsure of that statement. "You were icing over the entire workshop in your sleep," Bunny explained. "The only thing that even remotely helped was taking the staff. It's over there." He nodded towards the other end of the room, where Jack's staff stood leaned against the wall. "Everything's dripping wet now." Jack didn't know what else to do but continue to stare at him. "What? No, I can't. We can't." He trailed off as his eyes started gliding across the room. Now that Bunny had mentioned it, he could see blotches of water and even frost, everywhere from the floor to the ceiling, on the salon table in front of the couch, and the chairs beside it. Why hadn't he noticed it before? When he looked down at himself, he saw that he was almost free of frost, but the couch he was lying on was completely covered in it. It gave Jack at least a slight sense of relief against the pressing heat of the room. He looked back to Bunny. "What's going on?" "I tell you what is going on." Both Jack and Bunny jumped at North's sudden entrance. Bunny sighed, sending him an exasperated look. "Always with the perfect timing, eh?" he asked. North ignored him as he walked up to them. "I'm glad to see you awake, Jack," he said, wearing a warm smile. Yeah, me too," Jack said. Despite the growing pit in his stomach, seeing North in a good mood eased his mind a little. "Mind elaborating on what you said just now? And can someone please open a window or something?" "It's already freezing in here," Bunny protested. Jack wanted to argue, but North stepped in before they could start bickering again. "Jack," he said, sitting down in a chair beside the couch, "I have good and bad news." Jack gave him a wary look. "Okay," he said slowly. "What's the good news?" "In these past months, Jamie and the other children in Burgess have been telling your story," North said. "You no longer have only 7 believers. It is why I asked you if you felt any different, because as a guardian, your power is connected to the children's belief in you." The pit in Jack's stomach abruptly widened. "But I'm sick?" Jack asked. thinking back to last Easter and what had happened to the other Guardians' powers. Wouldn't it mean that they don't believe in me any— No, North quickly said, waving his hands. You asked for good news, no? Thing is, more children are believing in you, and though that makes you more powerful, it takes a toll on you in the beginning. Jack didn't understand. He glanced at Bunny, who just shrugged. Happened to all of us at some point, he said, when we first became Guardians. North nodded. You are closer to the world now than you were ever before, he said. Before you were Guardian, you were— He gestured with both his hands, as if he were physically weighing his words. Perhaps closer to ghost than spirit in some ways. Not connected with the physical space. But now your presence is stronger, more tangible, but thus also more vulnerable to outside forces. You must learn to work with that. He smiled in a mix between amusement and empathy. Those heat sprites you speak of, they are probably the cause of all this. As winter spirit, is no strange that you would get sick from such temperatures. Jack's eyes went up to the ceiling as realization dawned on him. So you're saying I have a cold, he concluded. In the most Jack Frost kind of way, North said with a laugh. But no worry, it will pass. We will look after you. Somehow those words didn't feel as soothing as they were probably meant to be. Not with these two. Sure, they had big hearts and all that, but North was a bit intense, and Bunny looked like he was grumpy just being here in a room that was supposedly freezing. Jake sighed through his nose. It was hard to stay focused. Being awake these few minutes was already exhausting him. He closed his eyes. Then can you please open a window? He asked again, and didn't even have the energy to care about how whiny he sounded. I'm melting. Figuratively. You sure about that? Bunny asked, and Jack could all but see the smirk on his face. Instead of coming up with something clever to say back to him, Jack just gave an annoyed grumble. He really wasn't himself, was he? I'm afraid you will just have to suffer through this, Jack, North said, and patted his shoulder sympathetically, and Jack gave a long, suffering sigh. Then there was the sound of a door opening. Jack didn't bother to see who came in, but he didn't need to when he heard the garbled speak of a Yeti. Phil, Jack noted. Ah, there it is, North said. Jack heard him get up. Thank you, Phil. Oh, yes, Jack is fine. You can go now. Jack snorted weakly when Phil said something in an indignant tone before the door shut again. He has a weak spot for you, Jack, North said with a chuckle, before he made an uncertain sound. Jack, is he awake? He's awake. He's just ignoring you, Bunny replied, right before Jack felt a paw hitting his face, not too gently. Jack groaned and pushed him away, opening his eyes to give him a glower. Bunny just looked amused by it all. There we go, he said, taking a step back from the couch. If I had my staff right now. Bunny just hummed dismissively. Whatever you say, Grumpy. Here, Jack, North said, and Jack turned to him to see that he was holding out a cup to him. Drink this. It will make you feel better. Jack gave the cup a doubtful look. What is it? He asked, tentatively taking it. It's not important, North said, waving his hand. He completely disregarded the look Jack sent him and just smiled. Hopefully it will speed up your recovery and make it easier to control your eyes. Hopefully, Jack repeated. North's choice of words made his mind flash back to Joyce's tea, except that tea hadn't actually been too bad, aside from the heat. At least the smell had been nice. This thing, however... Jack sniffed it and grimaced. No thank you. Just drink it, Frostbite, Bunny interrupted, rolling his eyes. I won't kill ya, and it's getting colder here by the second. And it will make you feel better, too, North reminded him, shooting Bunny a disapproving look. Jack almost rolled his eyes again, but just sighed and brought the cup to his lips. North and Bunny watched him like their titles should have been Wardens rather than Guardians, so he just had to get it over with. But as Jack tried to take a sip, all his lips came in contact with was a chunk of dark eyes. Jack peered at it for a couple of seconds, mouth hanging open. He'd frozen it? Both North and Bunny were looking expectantly at him. It's... Jack started, lowering the cup. Ice. North took the cup from him, but quickly set it down on the table with a small, surprised yelp, followed by some Russian word. Ah, he started. It's very cold. Okay. He brought his hands together, humming thoughtfully. Then he got to his feet. "All right, I will go make more. Stay right there, Jack." He hurried out of the room. "No problem," Jack replied dryly before sliding back down onto the couch. He sent Bunny a look through heavy eyelids. "I just gonna sit there? Thought it was more toothsome to watch people sleep. Or North. How does that song go again?" "Someone has to make sure you don't do anything stupid," Bunny said. "What could I possibly do in this state?" Jack mumbled, closing his eyes and covering them with his arm. Bunny gave a quiet chuckle. "Yeah, I'll take no chances knowing you." Jack didn't answer. He did peek back at Bunny from underneath his arm to see that he'd sat back in the chair North had previously occupied and was now holding a white egg and a pencil. At which point he'd gotten that, Jack didn't know. He didn't bother to ask and just closed his eyes, letting sleep take him away again. It felt like no time had passed at all when the sound of the door slamming open jolted Jack back out of his dreamless sleep. His hand automatically went for his staff, only to find that it wasn't there. By that time, he'd realized that the ruckus was just North and Phil coming back into the room again, with Phil saying something in Yeti-ish. North was holding a bowl this time. Beside Jack, Bunny was still painting eggs, but now there was a small pile of intricately painted, colorful eggs on the table. Jack supposed he'd been out for longer than it felt. It didn't make him feel any less grumpy. "I have a solution, Jack," North informed him, motioning for him to sit up. Jack didn't at first, but when North came over to sit at the edge of the couch, Jack scooted away, shooting him a bewildered look. North was oblivious, or he chose to ignore it. "I will help you." "Help me?" Jack repeated, but quickly understood what he meant when North used a spoon to scoop up some of the liquid and held it out to him. Jack stared at him. "I'm not going to be spoon-fed, thank you very much," he told him. Beside him, Bunny snorted quietly. Jack sent him a murderous look. "Do you have any other suggestions?" North asked, quirking a brow. "Just let me sleep," Jack grumbled, lying back down with his back to them. "He really is a teenager," Bunny mumbled. Jack was about to imitate him in a weird voice, but then North grabbed him by the arm and pulled him upright. "Come on now," he said merrily. He would have been more vocal with his annoyance if the world hadn't spun so violently, and he slumped against the wall, unable to stop a miserable moan. "Why?" he muttered. "It's for your own good," North said, holding the spoon out. There was a moment when no one spoke, in which Jack and North had a brief staring competition, and of course, with no energy to spare, Jack relented first. "Fine," he grumbled, pointedly ignoring Bunny's derisive smirk as North held the spoon in front of Jack's mouth. Halfway through the bowl, the medicine, or whatever it was, may or may not have frozen again, and it may or may not have been intentional. By that point, it wasn't even because Jack was annoyed by the whole thing, because he certainly still was, but because the stuff tasted horrible. Maybe Jamie would have appreciated his mom's tea more if he had a taste of this first. But no, Jack wouldn't wish that upon anyone, much less Jamie. Either way, he'd convinced North that half the bowl's content was more than enough for Jack, unless he wanted it all to come back up again. After that threat, North relented and told Jack he'd be back with a cup of water. Meanwhile, Bunny was now lounged in the chair in a position which looked very bad for his back, even if he was a rabbit, with a huge woolen blanket draped over him. He was still painting eggs with as much focus and dedication as earlier. Jack had, upon several occasions, tried to bother Bunny while he was working on his egg designs, but they were mostly fruitless attempts, which just led to Jack feeling moody for being ignored. This time, however, Jack was happy that Bunny's attention was fully occupied. It was like he wasn't even there. It made it much easier for Jack to relax. That, and it felt like the medicine was making him more tired as well, so when he finally got to lie back down, he only barely recollected seeing the pillow come closer before he was drawn back into the dream world. Contrary to his last nap, this one actually had dreams, or dream would be the right thing to say. Strange thing was, Jack was quick to notice that there was something about this dream, some kind of feeling that was hard to determine whether it was good or bad, or any of the two. Maybe it was just because it had been a while since Jack had dreamed at all, or maybe because it wasn't as much of a dream as it first seemed. The first thing he knew was that it was winter. Not surprising, considering Jack was rarely anywhere it wasn't winter. But still, this felt different. The winter felt hostile. It was dark, and it was cold and unknown. The snow fell onto Jack's eyes, making it hard to see, and he could only use his arms as a shield against it. There was fear inside of him, but it wasn't just any fear. It was familiar, but in the haze of his dream, he couldn't tell what it reminded him of. Through the falling snow, Jack started to discern something in the distance. He sped up, trudging through the snow on feet that ached from both cold and exhaustion. In the way of dreams, Jack knew what it was even before he got close enough to see it. A bundle of boulders in the crook of a small mountain. Jack felt himself getting dragged towards it, the image of the dream seeming hazy and unfocused as it did. As he crawled over the rocks, he spotted a small passageway, a cave in which he could take shelter from the storm. Jack got to his knees and crawled into the small cave, but when he got inside, he realized it wasn't small at all. He looked around, but even if he couldn't see much in the darkness, the echo of his movements revealed that it was bigger than it seemed on the outside. He fumbled around until he found the cave wall and leaned on it as he tentatively got to his feet, minding his head. Standing a bit hunched over, he slowly inched further into the cave. The sound of the howling winds outside got gradually dimmer as he went deeper, wondering just how big this cave was, and more importantly, whether or not something was already in there. If only he had some kind of light. Just as the thought crossed his mind, he spotted something faint in the darkness. At first, he thought it was a trick of his mind, because it was so faint that he was only able to see it when he didn't look directly at it. But the closer he came, the clearer he could see it. A reflection. A blue reflection on the humid cave wall. But where was it coming from? Jack looked around and reached beyond the reflection, following the wall. And then, where it looked like the cave met a dead end, his hand slipped into a narrow opening. A part of him feared something dangerous was waiting for him on the other side, but he couldn't help his curiosity. He crouched and peeked around the corner. The light was coming from something big and shiny, perched on some kind of pedestal made of stone in the middle of the cavern. A crystal, Jack realized. Its light cast dim reflections on the stone around it as if it were magic. Jack didn't know much about magic. His mom always told him to stay away from people who claimed they could control it, but then again, Jack didn't always listen to his mother. There was just something about the crystal. He wanted to go up to it, to study it, to touch it. But just as he made to squeeze through the narrow opening, there was a sudden, ear-piercing crash, and the cave rumbled. Jack threw himself backwards just in time as rocks fell onto the spot he'd just been standing, and then he was on his feet again, sprinting out of the collapsing cave. He stumbled back into the snowstorm and fell onto his knees, his heart pounding and his lungs gasping for air. The feeling of wanting to hold that crystal in his hand still lingered in the back of his mind, faint yet as clear as a lullaby. He was so cold. Why was he so cold? Jack! Jack woke with a start, his empty hands grasping for his staff. Instead, his fist connected with something furry, and Bunny groaned. Jack froze, bringing his hand to his own chest. "Oh, sorry," he said. In normal circumstances he would have laughed, but his mind was too occupied to lend itself to his and Bunny's usual back and forth. Bunny gave him a glower, but it quickly melted away once he met Jack's eyes. His thick brows furrowed. "Are you all right?" he asked. Jack opened his mouth, ready to say that he was, but the words didn't come out. It was just a dream, right? So why did the feelings remain? Was that normal with dreams? It's cold," he stammered, and began getting to his feet. Bunny seemed too shocked to stop him. "What?" I don't know," Jack muttered, his legs shaking slightly beneath his weight. For the first time in his immortal life, he wished he had socks or something. "It's just I think I remembered something." "Will flashbacks make you cold, though?" Bunny asked, standing as well. "You think I know?" Jack asked, snappier than he intended. He paused, rubbing his forehead. "Maybe it's the medicine or something. I don't know. But it's cold and I have to check something. I have to get back there." "Get back where?" Bunny asked, following Jack as he started walking towards his staff. What did you dream? It wasn't a dream, Jack protested, letting the I think part fall silent. It was a memory, and there was something more, something I was missing. I was doing something important, but I can't remember what it was, just a feeling. And then there was this... Why did he feel the need to keep the crystal a secret? Jack's hesitation made Bunny raise a questioning brow. What? He asked. Jack gestured weakly with a hand before he went to grab his staff. He twirled it idly without looking at Bunny. I'm not sure, he eventually replied. A small shudder went through his body, but the cold had subsided into something bearable by now. Maybe it really was the dream that made him cold. If so, it had to be more than a dream. He'd felt the phantom sensation of freezing from when he was a human. Jack looked up at Bunny. I have to go there. You can't go anywhere in this state, Bunny protested, going to grab Jack's arm, but Jack jumped away. You could try and stop me, Jack challenged with a smirk. He wasn't really in the mood for one of the chases right now, but he had to go do what he had to do. Though I guess it wouldn't be the first time you forced me to be at the workshop. Why don't you and the Yetis come and get me when I'm done? You can bring a bag if you'd like. Bunny smiled sardonically. You're not still mad about that, are ya? He asked. Jack couldn't help a small laugh. He supposed he and Bunny would always have some kind of quarrel going on, whether it was from kidnapping the other to the North Pole or starting a blizzard where it shouldn't be. Jack still felt guilty about that, the blizzard of '68, but Bunny seemed to have let it go. Their quarrels had become banter instead of arguments. Well, this was beginning to look like an exception. I'll forgive you if you let me go, Jack offered. Jack, that sounds like a no, Jack said, and before Bunny got to say anything more, he stomped his staff to the ground and a wave of icy wind shot through the room. Bunny gave a surprised shout as the sudden force pushed him backwards. By the time he was back on his feet, Jack had bolted for the door. Jack didn't know where in the workshop he was, but by this point he'd been there long enough to trust his navigation skills. He slammed it open and found himself in the hallway. Jack, Bunny barked. You're going to hurt yourself. Jack didn't listen. He ignored his exhaustion and bolted to the right, from where the ruckus of the workshop sounded. As he turned around to see if Bunny was following, he took to the air and sped up. Bunny didn't take long to burst out of the room as well, looking more exasperated than anything. Jack let out a laugh as he rounded a corner, covering the floor in a layer of slippery ice. He shot out into the vast room of the workshop, zigzagging between Yetis and only bumping into a couple of them, which was actually quite impressive, since the workshop seemed to spin around him. Sorry, he shouted, tried to gain some altitude, and then almost flew straight into a wooden beam. He gave a hoarse shout, changing direction at the very last moment, but the beam still collided with his shoulder. The impact sent him swiveling through the air, and he thought he blacked out for a second. He hit the floor and skidded across it. With Bunny close behind, Jack was sure he'd just lost the game of tag. But when he opened his eyes and managed to focus his vision, he realized he'd just landed in front of a big window, the vastness of a North Pole stretching from horizon to horizon outside. And beside it stood North, holding a hammer. If Jack hadn't been so used to it, the sight might have been concerning. North looked down at him with a perplexed expression, as one would when someone came crashing down from the ceiling. Jack staggered to his feet, leaning heavily on his staff as he did. Hey, North, he said nonchalantly, before he caught a glimpse of Bunny rapidly making his way through the workshop, in a much more elegant way than Jack's example. Jack pointed his staff at the window, and the wind pushed it open. He spoke before North could answer. Bye, North, and then he leaped into the open air. What? Jack! North shouted after him, but the wind had already taken a hold of Jack, whisking him away. And then he was in the clouds. Jack closed his eyes, knowing the wind would take him where he wanted to be. Because even if he didn't know how, he knew where the memory had taken place. Well, vaguely at least. He knew it was somewhere near Burgess. Even through the snowstorm, even if he'd felt lost in the dream, he recognized the woods. The cave was near the hills somewhere. He hoped. A lot had changed in 300 years after all. It didn't take long before he let himself fall towards the ground, knowing he'd arrived even before he saw it. He fell through the clouds, dyed red in the light of the late sunset, and then Burgess came into view down below. He took a moment to admire the way his eyes in the small town reflected the sunlight and how snow glittered on the rooftops. Then his eyes drifted over to where town faded into nature. He descended. The closer he got to the ground, the heavier his body felt. He didn't realize how fast he was descending until he hit the ground and he went sprawling into the snow. He groaned quietly as he pushed himself up, then leaned against the tree as he waited for the dizziness to pass. North's medicine had improved Jack's health, that was for sure. At least he didn't feel like he was melting anymore, or that he was in a constant state of unconsciousness, but that didn't mean he felt completely healed either. Whatever. He could rest after he'd found the cave. Jack pushed away from the tree and looked around himself. Now, where to start? He muttered. The sound of Pippa's counting grew fainter and fainter as Jamie ran through the snow in the woods, scouring for the perfect hiding spot. There was a faint voice in the back of his head that told him they'd all ventured further into the forest than their parents allowed, but they worried too much. The best hiding spots were out here, after all. He stopped for a moment, then spotted a huge root of a tree that he might just fit under. He ran over to it. "Hey, find your own hiding spot," Claude hissed. "Oh, sorry," Jamie snickered and ventured on. It was getting dark now, and harder to see where he was going. Pippa still hadn't stopped counting down. Jamie could see the beam of her flashlight far away and knew that if he switched on his own flashlight, he'd be found immediately. But if he hurried or ran far enough... His body adhered to his thoughts before he actually made a decision, and sped towards the hills, glancing behind himself every now and then to see if he was still visible to Pippa. He let out a small, panicked sound when he faintly heard her shout, "Ready or not, here I come." Jamie hunched down as her light shone across the trees and waited for her to turn around before he set into a run again. After a couple of minutes or so, a couple of minutes consisting of a lot of slipping and tripping on ice and tree roots, Jamie decided it was safe to turn on his flashlight. But just as he fished it out of his pocket, he spotted movement along the trees. He froze in place and stared ahead. Had he just imagined it? No, there it was again. Something white, something blue? Jamie frowned. He carefully made his way forward, trying not to make a sound in case he was mistaken. And as he got closer, the figure turned out to be a person after all, or rather, a spirit. Jack was walking among a rubble of stones, standing slightly hunched over, with his eyes turned to the ground. Obviously, he hadn't realized he wasn't alone. Jamie clicked on the flashlight. "Jack!" he said in a theatrical whisper. Jack responded by jumping backwards and tripping over his own feet. He landed on his butt, but still managed to point the staff defensively at Jamie. Jamie, who knew Jack would never have used his magic against him, no matter what, just grinned at him, pointing the flashlight at his own face to identify himself. Jack lowered his staff, his shoulders sinking with relief. "Jamie," he said, and Jamie immediately noticed that there was something off about his voice. Jack let out a small huff. "You scared me. I thought you were just a hiker or something." "You hurt me?" Jamie asked, walking over to offer him a hand. "I thought I was being quiet." Jack laughed and let Jamie help him up. Jamie watched as he got to his feet, taking note of how much he was leaning on his staff. Was he quivering? "Isn't it a bit too late to be out in the woods right now?" Jack asked, looking around. "Are you alone?" "No, or I guess maybe. We're playing hide and seek," Jamie explained, but his attention was only halfway focused on what Jack was saying. He was more interested in how he was saying it, and also in the fact that he seemed tired. Almost like Jamie's reflection had looked in the mirror every day for the past week. Jamie shifted nervously. "Where were you today?" he asked. Jack looked back at him, his expression blank before realization dawned on him. He brought a hand to his forehead. "Oh, I'm sorry, Jamie, He seemed to struggle for a moment before he sighed. "I forgot I said I would visit. But hey, I'll make it up to you. Tomorrow I can—" "Jack," Jamie interrupted unthinkingly, before he stood up on his toes and reached out to touch Jack's forehead. Jack jerked his head back in surprise, but Jamie didn't need any more but half a second of contact to understand that something wasn't quite right. He sent Jack a worried look. "You're sick," he said, louder than he'd intended. Jack's mouth opened and closed, his eyes darting around as if searching for an excuse. Jamie knew that look. He did the exact same thing whenever his mom accused him of doing something he shouldn't. "Well, yes," he started slowly, "but... so that's why you didn't come." Jack seemed to consider that for a moment before he sat down on one of the boulders he'd previously been walking over, heaving a sigh. "It's apparently something that can happen after all," he said, and breathed a tired smile. "I've been sleeping off my fever," he said the word as if he didn't believe it existed, "for the past hours. North gave me some medicine, which, by the way, is much worse than your mom's tea, to lessen the symptoms, so I feel better now. It's nothing to worry about." Jamie frowned. Jack always tried to put on a carefree face in front of him and the other children, like Jamie sometimes did in front of Sophie. He just didn't want Jack to exhaust himself for, well, he wouldn't say for Jamie's sake, but Jack hadn't even known he was here. He was here for some other reason. "Wait, what are you doing here then?" Jamie asked. Jack seemed confused too for a moment. "Oh, right," he then said, but before he got to say anything more, a light suddenly flashed past them, followed by Pippa's way too close voice. "Cupcake," she said slowly. "Jamie?" "Quick, hide," Jamie hissed, looking frantically for a hiding place. Jack reacted immediately, as if he'd been in on the game from the start. He got to his feet, eyes scanning the area. "Come on," he whispered, now with a playful smile on his face despite his weary condition. The two of them ran up the hill, just as Pippa's flashlight shone upon the spot they'd been standing in. "I heard you," Pippa said gleefully. "Come on," Jack repeated excitedly, and Jamie tried to keep his laugh down. They hid behind a small boulder, waited, then continued. Jamie caught a glimpse of Pippa, but she seemed to have lost the trail. "There," Jamie said towards the collection of bigger boulders by the mountainside. Jack followed, and they crouched behind the rocks, peeking out to see if Pippa was still coming closer. Jamie snickered quietly to himself when Pippa seemed to give up, hesitantly turning back. Jack gave a half-choked gasp just then. Jamie turned towards him to see that he was looking around himself with wide eyes. It was strange behavior, but Jamie didn't pretend to understand everything Jack did. He always assumed it had something to do with his nature as a magical being. "What is it?" he asked. "It's here," Jack said, but the way he said it made it sound like he was speaking to himself more than Jamie. "Right?" Jamie frowned. "What is?" Jack didn't reply, but got to his feet, scanning the area. His eyes fixed on one specific boulder, and he walked over to it. Jamie didn't do anything but watch as Jack put his hands on it and pushed. His face scrunched up as he strained, frost spreading from his fingertips and across the stone. Based on Jack's build, Jamie would have never imagined he'd be strong, at least not physically, but to his own amazement, the boulder slowly gave way to Jack's insistent pushing. Now, Jamie didn't understand what was going on, but since Jack seemed so determined, it had to be important. He got to his feet, darting over to him. "It's moving," he said encouragingly. Jack seemed somehow paler than usual, which got Jamie thinking that maybe encouraging him wasn't the smartest thing to do, with the state that Jack was in. But before Jamie got to make up his mind about that, the ground underneath the boulder gave way, and the stone toppled over with a dull thud, rolling down the hill in a few meters before coming to a stop. "Whoa," Jamie muttered, awestruck. He was about to say how cool that was, but Jack was leaning quite heavily on his staff now, with a slight gleam on his forehead. Are you okay, Jack?" "Yeah," Jack offered Jamie a reassuring smile. "Brute strength is more North's. Whatever. Look." He pointed at the ground where the boulder had just been. "What's—" Jamie started, but trailed off once he realized what he was looking at. "Is that a cave?" "Yeah," Jack said. He was frowning now, as if deep in thought. Then he nodded. "I'm going to see what's inside." "Isn't that dangerous?" Jamie asked. "What if there's a bear in there or something?" "The cave's been closed off for a long time," Jack said, crouching down. "And, either way, there's nothing in there that will be able to hurt me. I'll be back in a second." Jamie grabbed Jack's wrist. "I want to come with you." Jack's expression already told Jamie what the answer was going to be, but Jamie interrupted him by shining his flashlight in Jack's face. "How are you going to see anything without this?" he asked triumphantly. "You can't see in the dark, can you?" Jamie realized he didn't know whether or not Jack Frost could see in the dark. It would make sense if he could, now that he thought about it. The winter months were dark, after all. "Can you?" he asked, more sincerely this time. Jack seemed thoughtful, as if he wasn't sure if he could see in the dark either, but Jamie suspected he was thinking about something else. "All right," he said with a lopsided smile. "I'll need an adventure partner." Jamie grinned and followed Jack, crawling on all fours into the small opening. As soon as he was inside, he noticed how muffled the sounds from outside became, as if they were a lot further into the cave than they actually were. He didn't know enough about caves to know if that was normal, but wrote it off as nothing, as to not freak himself out. He shone the flashlight around the chamber. The beginning of the cave was cramped, but it went much deeper than Jamie had anticipated, sloping downwards. It wasn't steep, but it was still steep enough to creep him out a bit. Jack looked around with a strange, dreamy expression on his face. "Watch your step," he told Jamie, holding out his hand to him. "It's slippery." Jamie nodded and took Jack's hand. They carefully inched down into the cave together. "What did you mean by 'it's here'?" Jamie asked. "Have you been here before?" Jack hesitated for a moment. "I think so," he said. "I had a dream about it earlier. I think it was a memory." "A memory?" Jamie repeated blankly. "Yeah, it's a long story," Jack said with a weak laugh. "There are some things that I can't remember that well, and sometimes those memories come back to me. And I remember this cave and—" He trailed off. Jamie was about to answer, but then he pointed his flashlight at whatever had made Jack stop talking. "It's collapsed," Jamie said. Jack sighed. "Sure has," he said, like he'd expected it. He still sounded disappointed, though. "I guess our adventure stops. There you are!" Both Jack and Jamie jumped at the sudden voice, Jack automatically pulling Jamie closer to himself. Jamie pointed the flashlight towards the voice and gasped. "The Easter Bunny!" he exclaimed, jumping away from Jack to greet the Easter Bunny, or just Bunny as Jack called him. "Jamie?" Bunny said, sounding confused. Then his eyes turned toward Jack's, brows furrowing. "Bunny!" Jack laughed. "How'd you find me?" "Followed the scent of spirit influenza," Bunny said dryly. "What are you... Is this what you were talking about? And what's he?" He trailed off for a moment, looking back at Jamie. He offered him a small smile. "Long time no see, Jamie." Jamie grinned at him. "I found Jack while we were playing hide and seek," he explained. "I mean, not because he was playing with us, I just found him by chance, and I wanted to help him." He was quick to explain because Bunny was wearing the look of someone who was about to go on a lecture, but he wouldn't be able to do so if Jamie took the blame, at least while Jamie was present. Jack seemed to understand what Jamie was doing, elbowing him slightly with an amused smile on his face. "And Bunny, the fact that you're here now must only be a sign, don't you think?" he asked. Bunny narrowed his eyes. "What are you playing at?" Jack turned and patted the stones blocking their path. "There's something on the other side," he said. "I know there is." Jamie was confused too now, and very intrigued. "What is?" he asked. "Jack," Bunny started exasperatedly. "Come on, Bunny," Jack pleaded. "Just let me see, and then I'll promise I'll come back to the pole and drink some more of that awful stuff North cooked up or whatever. I just need to see if it's still there first." "If what is still there?" Bunny asked, and though he still sounded annoyed with this whole ordeal, Jamie caught a glimpse of curiosity in his eyes. That could come in handy. Jack shrugged. "I'm not sure," he said, "but it seemed important." Jamie looked from Jack to Bunny and back again. The two of them stared at each other in a battle of wills. Could guardians communicate with their minds? Jamie made a mental note to ask Jack about that later. Bunny heaved a sigh. "All right, fine," he said, tapping his foot on the ground. "You are such a pain in the—" Jamie didn't get to hear the end of that sentence, as the ground suddenly gave away beneath him. Before he'd even gotten to panic about falling into a magical hole in the ground, gravity seemed to reverse, and he fell upwards. And then he was sitting on the ground again, now in a different place. He looked around himself and saw that Jack looked almost as confused as Jamie felt. Bunny appeared a moment later, hopping out of another hole. "Whoa!" Jamie exclaimed. That's how you travel around so quickly? That's so cool. Can you travel anywhere in the world like that? Bunny chuckled. Of course. Didn't your sister tell you about her little adventure? Jamie blinked. Wait, is that what you meant by... There. Both Jamie and Bunny turned towards Jack, who had walked further into the cave. When Jamie saw what Jack was seeing, he wondered how he hadn't immediately noticed. It was a crystal, blue and oval-shaped, about the size of an apple, with a faint glow emanating from it. The glow alone made it clear that there was something magical about it, but the fact that it was propped up on some kind of podium made it look like someone had put it there for a reason. What is that? Jamie asked, his voice coming out as an odd whisper. I don't know, Jack breathed, his gaze transfixed. Jamie felt pressure on his shoulder, and he looked down to see Bunny's paw there. He realized he'd been inching towards the crystal without meaning to. Jack, Bunny said softly, how did you know this was here? Jack didn't immediately answer. He kept staring at the crystal, his mouth slightly open. I told you. It was a memory, he said, his voice strangely quiet. He took a step closer to it. There was a storm and I had to find shelter somewhere. I found this cave, but just as I spotted the crystal, the cave collapsed. I barely made it out. He frowned. Someone must have been in here to bury it, but it doesn't look like anyone's been in here for at least 300 years. Jamie walked up to Jack's side, ignoring Bunny's gentle attempt at keeping him back. What does it do? He asked, leaning slightly closer to the crystal. Something about it scared him. No, it wasn't the crystal that scared him. It was the fact that he wasn't able to discern what it was exactly that the crystal made him feel. He grabbed onto Jack's sweater. Jack? Jack's eyes seemed even bluer in the light of the crystal, and glassier too, like he was far away. But when Jamie said his name, he looked down at him, the frown on his face fading just a little. I don't know, he said, but I feel like... He looked up at the crystal again. Like... Jack, Bunny said wearily. Jack let out a small breath, and Jamie turned his eyes to him just in time to see his expression go slack in shock. Emily? He whispered and reached out. Jack, don't! Bunny shouted, but it was too late. Jack touched the crystal, and the world turned to dust around them, darkness swallowing them whole. Jack didn't know what he was seeing. At first there was the glow of the crystal, enwrapping him and strangling him, yanking him off the ground. There was wind in his hair, but somehow no oxygen. There were colors, yet it was dark. And there was sound, yet excruciating silence. His mind was so scrambled with panic, he was only aware of one thing, Jamie's hand clutching his hoodie. Jack crouched and pulled Jamie close to his chest. He needed to protect him. Protect him from what? Jack didn't know. He couldn't think, he could only do. There were voices, sounds, but he couldn't make out any of it. There was nothing at all. He was flying. No, he was falling. Down, down, down. He thought he saw stars in the same blue as the crystal, twinkling among the flickering images. Something grabbed his hood and pulled him backwards. He landed harshly on the cold, hard ground, and he opened his eyes. Jack, come on! It was Bunny. Jack stared at him. Inexplicably, he felt like he hadn't seen him in a very long time. And then he looked back at the crystal, or rather what once was a crystal. The podium was further away from him now. Jack didn't know why he was suddenly in a far corner of the cave, watching as something grew from where the crystal had been. Something dark, flickering, never assuming any discernible form, and in the midst of it was a couple of ice-blue lights. Jack? Jack tore his eyes away from the thing at the sounds of Jamie's weak voice. Jamie was staring at it as well, but it looked like he was struggling to stay awake. Let's go, Bunny said, and tapped twice on the ground with his foot. This time, Jack was prepared. He held Jamie close to himself, clenching his eyes shut as Bunny transported them elsewhere. Fresh cold air was the next thing that met them, and Jack opened his eyes when he heard the faint rumble. They were back in the forest, but far away from the cave. The sky was filled with stars, but that wasn't possible, was it? They'd only been in there for a few minutes. Look, Bunny said, and pointed at the sound of the noise. It was hard to spot against the night sky, but Jack was almost grateful for it. It was like a shadow snuffing out the light of the stars, stretching and growing and shifting. Jack didn't understand what he was looking at, and he was running out of time to figure it out. He saw it by the way darkness creeped into the corners of his eyes and how his body seemed to become heavier. He tried calling Bunny's name, but was unsure if he actually did. His body sagged sideways, and all he could focus on was keeping Jamie close, before his head hit the snow and darkness enveloped him once more.